The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Friday, June 27th, and I'm Cynthia Connolly, Director of Programming here at the City Club, and I'm so pleased to introduce today's forum, which is part of the City Club's Education Innovation Series. Today, we are talking about Ohio's regional public universities, the likes of Cleveland State and the universities of Akron and Toledo. Together, they serve more students than any single university in the state, including the state's flagship. Yet they're often overlooked in both local and national big picture conversations about higher education, even though most Americans who do go to college attend an institution within 50 miles of their home. Now, these colleges are being forced to reinvent themselves, dealing with local workforce demands, adapting to shifting student needs, and sometimes fighting for survival. All of this comes amid enrollment drops, challenging demographics, and pressure at both the state and federal levels. It is noteworthy that today is also the day that Senate Bill 1, the Enact Advance Ohio's Higher Education Act, is put into effect. The bill targets diversity, equity, and inclusion, bans faculty strikes, among other measures. It was sponsored by State Senator Jerry Serino, who did discuss the details of that bill at the City Club back in April. Joining us today are both local and national experts who will discuss the future of regional public universities. What is working, what is not, and what would it mean for Ohio's communities if these universities were to close their doors? Here with us to discuss this and more is Dr. Jennifer Koip, Executive Director at the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities, which has a membership of 39 public urban research universities across 27 states. The coalition focuses on urban university engagement and key urban challenges in our nation's cities. Also with us is Dr. Cecilia M. Orphan, Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of Denver and founding co-director at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. She researches how regional public universities promote equity and community well-being and how policy shapes higher education's public purposes and equity pursuits. And also with us is Dr. Nigamont Streeter, Senior Vice President and Provost at Cleveland State University, and in this role he serves as the Chief Academic Officer and oversees all academic offerings at the university. Moderating the conversation is Amy Morona. She is a statewide higher education reporter at Signal, Ohio. If you have questions for our guests during the Q&A portion of the forum, you can text it to 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will try to work it into the program. Now, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming all of our guests here today.
Well, thank you all, and thank you to my esteemed panel here. My name is Amy Morona. I'm the higher education reporter at Signal, Ohio, and for the sake of this conversation, some important framing for me is I'm also a graduate, a first-generation graduate of a regional public university, and I spend a lot of time covering regional publics too, so very excited to be here for this conversation. But Cecilia, why don't we start with you? You know, higher ed loves an acronym, loves a long, clunky name, but what exactly is a regional public university? Who attends them? Where are they?
That's a great question, and it's one that I've spent the balance of my career trying to answer because there's not broad understanding of what these institutions are. Before I get into defining them, I just want to say what an honor it is to be here. I actually did my dissertation research at Cleveland State and a few other universities in Ohio, so it feels like a very full circle moment right now, and part of that work was to help define what a regional public university is. Regional public universities are not ivory tower institutions, very much like we see Cleveland State in the midst of a downtown area, very much enmeshed in the local community. These are institutions that have missions to be of service to their community and their region. And because of that, you will often see the place name of where they're located in their name, like Cleveland State, like the University of Toledo, like Shawnee State University, that's right next to the Shawnee Forest in southern Ohio, in a rural part of the state in Appalachia. And so that is a very important part of their mission. How can we be of service to the region? And that looks like being accessible to anyone who wants to pursue a college education. That looks like reduced barriers for admission, and it's something that's really interesting in higher education. We often define excellence by how many people we exclude and keep out, which is very much antithetical to the purpose of education, which is meant to involve people in bettering themselves and uplifting themselves. And so regional publics have really worked to redefine excellence by how many people they include and uplift to the same level of excellence. As you can attest to, and I as well, I was a first-generation college student, attended a regional public. My life was changed by that opportunity. And we know that around 34% of the students who attend regional publics, they're eligible for Pell Grants, which means they're very low income, and often that also means they're first generation. They also educate a large share of students of color and adult learners, veterans, immigrants, undocumented students. So they're just really important access points for higher education. And then the last piece I'll share about how we can define and think about them is that they are very student-centered. So this is not to say that they don't do research, because sometimes in conversations I hear people saying there's the research institutions, then there's the regional publics. But there is a group like Cleveland State, which I know Nagameth is going to speak to, that do conduct research. Often that research is in service to the local community. So it's addressing local challenges, it's supporting the local school district. And so that kind of student-centered nature involves those students in the research about the communities that they come from, because most of the students who attend a regional public are from that local community. And they, in fact, graduate and they go back into that community and they become its business leaders, its school teachers, its nurses. And so there's just a lot that these schools do to support their region.
Thank you for that. A quick follow elevator question and answer before we open up the conversation to our friends. Something I think about a lot, and I think is important to the jump of this conversation. What about people who didn't go to a regional public? If I'm sitting watching this at home and I didn't go to CSU or Akron, why should I care about what a regional public is and what they do and who they serve? Why does that matter to communities broadly?
That's a great question. Another way we can think about these institutions is they're stewards of place, and that's something that the American Association of State Colleges and Universities describes them as. That's the membership association for these institutions. And that means that if you live within a 30 to 50 mile radius of regional public, even if you didn't attend that school and your kids, you're not planning to send them there, there are still ways in which that institution touches your life. It probably educated the teachers that your child is learning from, or it does small business incubation, which is particularly important in rural communities. So some of the work that we have done through the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges is to identify rural serving institutions that are also regional publics. And we know that half of these institutions are like your Shawnee states that serve a very remote part of a rural community. If that institution didn't exist, then those people would not have the opportunity to go to college. But beyond that, they're also doing small business incubation in these rural communities, which is really important because rural communities have the highest per capita number of small businesses in the country. So that's another way in which your life, if you live near a regional public, which most people do because the policy that led to their creation was really intended to make sure every American lived within 50 miles of a college or a university. Your life is touched by a regional public university. And we also know through research that the economies of regions that have regional publics in them, they recover more quickly from recessions, they're economically more robust, and a lot of that has to do with the fact, which I'm sure you'll speak to later, that they align their degree offerings with the economic needs of the region.
Jennifer, I'm sure a lot of what Cecilia said resonates with you, so I'm curious with your group, the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities. Many of your members are RPUs in cities, places like the University of Toledo, Cleveland State, rejoining your group soon. What can you tell us just more specifically about those institutions and how intertwined they are to the cities in which they sit?
Sure, and in many ways, I'm following up or duplicating what Cecilia said. So really, urban serving universities are qualitatively different than urban located universities. Just because you have a zip code that is in a city does not mean you are truly urban serving. And that is the basis of the members of our organization, which I should say, I want to almost out myself. Our organization is affiliated with APLU, which is the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, and it includes major R1 and R2 public research universities, including some flagships. And some of our members are also flagships, but still urban serving. But I'm happy to speak from the fact that many of them are also regional comprehensive, regional universities as well. So when you are urban serving, you are not just in a city, you are of the city. You are a citizen of that city. And you rise and fall in some ways with the city, and the city rises most often with the activities of the university. And it's very intertwined. Urban serving universities are often called anchor institutions because they're intertwined so intimately with what is happening in the ecosystem of major urban areas. We just had an event where we invited our advisory council, which are representatives from organizations that are not higher ed, but are on the other side of the coin of the issues that urban institutions are focused on. The Alliance to End Hunger, the Council for Large Public Housing Authorities, the Conference of Mayors, the City Managers Association, the National Association of City Transportation Officers, National League of Cities. We're looking into inviting the association related to chambers of commerce or superintendents, because this is who the urban serving universities are working with for the betterment of the city and their students. It's not, it's a very porous relationship between institution and city, and to be able to uplift them. And we see that the effects of that are pretty substantial. Many of our members, in fact, are on the U.S. News and World Report social mobility, national social mobility rankings. And actually the two institutions from USU are tied for first place on that. And while sometimes that's not the metric that gets the most attention, it is a pretty important metric when you think about the purposes of higher education, to really enact social mobility. And so that's on the student level, but you're also uplifting communities. These institutions are very connected to the economies of the area. They serve often a public health interest. They're contributing to the educational elements of the community. Sometimes they're the only fine arts, fine and performing arts centers in major urban areas. So urban serving universities, and often, which overlaps pretty heavily in a Venn diagram with the institutions we're talking about on this panel, are really doing so much for that community and the students in it. They reflect most often the students that are in those cities. They typically will recruit most heavily from there, and the students generally stay there and are contributing back civically, economically, and whatnot. And what's really exciting too is that these are also becoming destinations of choice for faculty members because of their connection to industries of the area. So a couple of our member presidents were doing a panel, and one of them said an idea that the other two latched onto, and I love, which is for a faculty member, the timeline from idea to impact in the research you're doing in these spaces is very short. Right? The work you're doing isn't just going to go up in the ether or just this because it's interesting. It has immediate impact often on the community or in the industries of the area. And that's really exciting. Without going down a sort of dangerous political path, we also see the widest array of 21st century learners in these spaces, and not just personal identities or ethnicity or race. We're also talking about, as you mentioned, adult learners, commuter students, poverty-affected students, returning students, students with dependents, veterans and active GIs. The list goes on and on. Commuters, transfers, sometimes those that are a little harder to identify. And I particularly resonate with this. I didn't bring my phone up here just because of time, but my father is a graduate, and his master's degree is from Cleveland State, and my grandfather is a graduate of Fenn College, which became part of Cleveland State in 1965. But he went many years before that, and was texting with my dad last night, and he said, I have to find this, but he said, you can point to your grandpa. First in the history of a family to graduate from college with immigrant parents. He would get up at 3 a.m., go with his father down to the market in downtown Cleveland, load the fish, meat, and produce in the truck, and drive to grandpa's grocery store, unpack it, and then go to class. After, he would deliver groceries to customers' homes, study at night until bedtime, and then start over again. He went on to get his undergraduate degree in engineering and drafting and was the first in his family. And almost every one of his children and grandchildren have earned a degree. That's the kind of work that these institutions are doing. I don't mean to be self-serving with that. I will pass on the applause, but it just was so illustrative and just a text. I mean, this wasn't like, hey, tell me what to say. But it was, these are the stories of the students in these communities. And my grandfather and his family went back and lived in Cleveland for their entire lives, as did most of their children. So that's the kind of story of that contribution and connection to the communities and surrounding areas.
Can I just add to this story, because there's this beautiful archival image of Fenn Tower, which was one of the first buildings of Cleveland State still standing. And if you look at this photo, and I use it a lot in my presentations about regional publics, there's a giant parking lot surrounding the building because it offered a lot of night classes for students exactly like Jennifer's grandfather. And parking was a huge accessibility issue. And so this is a way in which these regional publics historically and still to this day promote access in often unseen or unnoticed ways that are so important.
We can't keep this provost from all of this Cleveland State talking. I know this man is itching to jump into this conversation.
Thank you. I should just sit here and let these two folks talk about the great things that the Cleveland State is doing. But I want to pull on a couple of threads from what both Jennifer said and Cecilia said. So Jennifer, to your point about research and the proximity of research that you talked about, I'll just tell you my own personal story. I've been at Cleveland State University for 21 years. I came here in 2004 to be a faculty member in the computer science department. I earned my doctoral degree at Ohio State, which is an R1, also urban serving, but an R1 institution. And my first 3 or 4 years, my research was essentially replicating the kinds of things that I used to be doing as a graduate student. And then, and I was looking around the community, and I said, what I'm doing here doesn't have direct relevance to what's happening around me. I probably wrote papers that a half a dozen other people around the world read, and that's it, right? And it sat on a shelf. And so about 6 years in, I had the opportunity and the privilege to reinvent and work on computer science education. And I just came from Julka Hall down the street, where there are about 250 young people, middle schoolers and high schoolers, who are in 23 different STEM camps. Just this week, but then over the summer, we will serve about 800 students, middle schoolers and high schoolers, and about 80 teachers who will be receiving professional development. And that all began in 2013, when we worked with 4 teachers statewide in showing them what computer science could be at the high school level, right? So that's that idea of proximity to place and translating a faculty member's research into what happens in the real world. So that's just a quick personal story. But I want to just pull on all I'm going to do is just give you examples of what happens at CSU to what Cecilia said and what Jennifer said about the various kinds of things, right? When you talk about academic programs that are relevant to our community, right? I'll give you the example of a new program in construction management that we just developed. This was a program that we created because industry came to us and said, we can't find talent soon enough. We can't find the kinds of people that need to come in and work on our projects. So you need to produce more graduates in this area. And so we said, okay, we can do that, but who's going to fund it? And they said, we'll do it, right? 35 companies came in and put money on the table and helped us create that program. We talk about how are we creating relevance for the community. We have this program called Swim the Gap. That's a collaboration between our College of Health and the Cuyahoga County, as well as the City of Cleveland and City of Warrensville Heights, where we will provide swim training for about 3,000 fourth graders, mostly kids of color, who normally would not have swim training at that age, right? To create an opportunity for a life-saving skill and something that every child needs to have. Our Small Business Development Center in our College of Business works on providing opportunities for students who are most likely first generation who don't have the opportunity to work on creating startup companies and things like that, but providing them with the kinds of platforms to say how can they take an idea and translate that idea into something real and provide them with some kind of startup capital to move on from there, right? I could go on. There's an example from every single academic college and academic program that we can go. But those are some. I'll just say that's how we live the idea of what a regional public university is, right? And then one last point I'll say as well. Cecilia, you brought up research and the idea of some of these regional public universities also having a pretty deep footprint in federally funded research, right? And I'll give you one example. In our College of Arts and Sciences, we have the Center for Gene Regulation in Health and Disease, which is a group of 17 faculty members in biology, physics, chemistry, and biomedical engineering, who over the last decade have brought $50 million of NIH funding to Cleveland State to do high quality, what is called basic research. I want to take just a second to define what I mean by basic research. It's not research that's easy to do. It's research that is the hardest to do, which is you're asking scientific questions for the sake of asking those questions, not because there is a product that's going to show up next year in the market, but because you're asking a question which could lead to a drug discovery 20 years down the line, right? I'll just give you one example of that because, and then I'm
last
gonna,
example.
Last
time,
example.
Please.
Thank you, moderator. I have there's a faculty member, this is really cool because you walk into his lab and he's got these refrigerators full of little test tubes with fruit flies. Because fruit flies, their entire life cycle lasts about 70 days. But if you want to study Alzheimer's disease and how brain aging occurs, doing that in an organism that has a life cycle of 70 days is much easier than somebody that has a life cycle of 70 years, right? So, that is work that could lead to drug discovery years down the line, right? But having access to that kind of research for first-generation students from Cleveland is really, really critical.
Talking about research, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the past 6 months and the federal and state pressures we've seen. At the federal level, we've seen research cuts across the country to some of those programs, those NIH-funded programs. We've also seen all kinds of things. That's certainly an understatement of preemptive DEI compliance and financial pressures. Different things. So I'm curious from our two national experts, how are we seeing these federal and state pressures play out at RPUs, and how might that be different than, say, private colleges?
So I can start, and Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you. But I think one really important thing to note is that regional public universities have been facing these pressures for a long time because states have become very politically active within higher education. So an example of that is in Idaho. Boise State University is literally in the sightline of the state legislature, and they have been the focal point of a lot of the anti-DEI legislation and organizing like a couple years ago. And so I think what's happening at the federal level, a lot of those policymakers have studied what other states have done and are borrowing some of those tactics and the language from the legislation to put in the executive orders and such. So for a lot of regional publics, this is not new policy. What's different is that now the federal government is getting involved. So that's one thing to know. The second is this conversation around indirect costs. One thing the Trump administration...
To clarify quickly, can we do a
Yes,
quick...
I'll define. I was about to define it.
Got you. Thank you.
So indirect costs are basically like the tax an institution charges for the cost that it requires to create that infrastructure that Nagameth was just talking about, the labs, the staff that clean and maintain the labs, all of the infrastructure that goes around research, that takes money. And a lot of institutions don't have that money already, especially regional public universities that have, for every student, $1,000 of state and federal funding to the $20,000 per student that the Ohio State University has. And so these are very leanly funded institutions. And when you one thing the Trump administration is critical of is that indirect cost that institutions charge on these large federal grants and contracts, and is trying to pull that away. Well, if that happens, that means all of that tax that the institution can charge the federal government to be able to create the opportunities for this research, that goes away. And that will completely carve out the research that these institutions are doing if it happens. Other institutions like the Ohio State, they have an endowment in the billions of dollars. They can more likely absorb those losses than a regional public. So that's just one example I'll describe, and I'll turn it over to you,
Jennifer, how are your members handling things now?
It's certainly difficult, and being associated with APLU, which is all Research 1 and Research 2 universities, and many of all of our members are at least R2, if not R1, are affected by the closing of these grants, grant agencies, these federal agencies, as well as the limitations on indirect costs. In fact, one institution that was in our membership did a back-of-the-napkin math one time, just quick math. It said, like, if the indirect costs go to the level they thought they would have, that would put them in a deficit of $200,000 a day. And they are an R2, relatively small research activity in comparison to some of other members. So this is real operating costs that are affecting things.
Can I ask, whenever someone tells you about a napkin math like that, which such a staggering figure, what do you say back to them?
Well, I mean, I thank goodness that you're a part of this organization, because right now APLU is in, really fighting the good fight for that. Did you want to say something on it? Or, okay.
Oh, just what is R1, R2 might be helpful
okay.
to
So research universities, the Carnegie classification, or Carnegie Foundation does a classification of four-year institutions, and they give them either a designation of research activity, and R1 is very high research activity. In terms of, I'm forgetting the exact cutoff, but they get...
It's $50 million in funding every year and 70 PhD graduates every year.
Yes, so that's the highest level of research activity. And then there are R2s that are lesser, I think it's 10 million, is it?
So R2 is 5 million of research expenditure and 20 PhD graduates a year. So Cleveland State is an R2. Yes. Our research expenditure is actually higher than that 50 million level. But we produce about 40 PhDs on average. So therefore, we fall in that R2 category.
Thank you.
Can we just segue back to the pressures, just so we don't get too lost in the weeds here for time?
So the research is definitely one thing, but there are other pressures that I have my eye on too that are really affecting these institutions as well. There's a lot going on with financial aid policies and how that are going to students and universities. And the way that they are being structured is such that the students that are attending these kinds of institutions, the ones that are poverty affected, first generation, any other, will be affected more than others who might have other resources, other cultural capital or social capital to backfill that. So I do have grave concerns about some of that financial aid policy and going into effect, and what that means for students at our campuses in terms of the larger financial picture. And then the other is, honestly, all the changes, we don't think about them, is immigration and international students also are going to gravely affect these spaces as well. And that may seem one step removed, but it does have financial implications for students who are enrolling, what they feel comfortable if they're able, given their classification in immigration, what they're able to get access to. And then the last is, if you look at the overall architecture, and I'm not here to explain what's happening in the administration or the choices they're making, please don't make me do that. But
that's the next forum.
Yeah, thank God. But it does appear that pretty universally they're trying to push a lot of, make the federal footprint smaller and the state footprint larger. The things they are moving to the state level tend to be things that pull from the same pot of money, set of other resources, or constituency attention and public heartstrings as higher education. And so there's going to be a lot more competition in that space for not a whole lot of resources. So the pie is going to, I'm a little worried the pie is going to get cut a little smaller as you start seeing Medicaid getting pushed down, other federal policies getting pushed to state level. even the management, like with the U.S. Department of Education getting pushed down to the state level, there's just less resources to do more things, and that will take a lot of, I think, attention and resources and finances away from these kinds of institutions that are state funded. So there are multiple things that I'm looking at right now that are intersecting to affect these institutions financially.
Amy, if I may, just a quick, this isn't a financial impact. The financial impact, I'll just agree with what Jennifer and Cecilia said, but from a real impact for students, right? I mean, again, when research funding gets cut, when indirect costs get cut, what impact happens is on our undergraduate students, because in many of our labs, there's, our faculty members describe this as a scaffolding of faculty members working with postdoctoral researchers who are mentoring graduate students, who are in turn mentoring undergraduate students, who mentor high school students who come into the labs, right? So there's that whole sequence of mentoring that occurs. And again, like I pointed out, I mean, 50%, 49% of our undergraduate population is on the Pell. 48% of our students are first generation, right? So when we talk about that high number of students who will not get another experience to be in a research lab, that is the real impact, quite aside from what dollars and what staffing issues that we might have to have.
For sure, and as you guys can see, this is such a robust conversation. We could keep going for hours, but I hope there's threads that folks pick up on for our Q&A section, which we will segue to momentarily. So last question, this is purely for fun, honestly, for my own enjoyment. Just something I've been wondering kind of broadly, a big transition, is if you could wave a magic wand and have someone understand something about RPUs or about your institution that you think is misunderstood, what would that be? Like, what's one thing you really want people to know, or one misconception you really want to clear, or you want to tell people in this room one thing that they'll walk out and say, I learned this specific thing? What would that be?
I could start really quickly. I have attended a community college, a regional public, and an Ivy League institution. And the best teaching I ever experienced was at the regional public. Those are exceptional teachers, and the educational quality is excellent. And the assumption is that it's poor quality. And there's actually research to back that up, that the excellence in teaching happens in this sector. It doesn't happen at the hotshot, high-powered research institutions.
That's a good one. Because it is. If I had to pick a different one altogether, the variety of academic programming that happens at regional public universities. And again, this isn't just about CSU. There's probably 100 institutions across the country that, if you take out the name and the colors, will be exactly the same. They'll have about 70 to 80 undergraduate programs, about 70 to 80 graduate programs, and 2 or 3 really strong research areas. And that's the thing, right? So when you talk about what is missing or what is unknown, it is finding that critical connection between the whatever the regional public is and what is the big area in that city or in that community, right? And that connection between the gravity of the city and what happens at that university.
Jennifer, you get the benefit of thinking while they're talking, or so. Last word with you.
Every higher education institution is dedicated in their mission to 3 things: research, teaching, and service. Those are the fundamental pillars of what higher education does, particularly public higher education, but all of it. You usually have, we nod and say, like, the flagships, they do the research, and the rest of it is kind of much less weighted, right? If you look at the pie chart of activity. Liberal arts colleges, that's all the teaching, right? With much less that. These institutions, if you were to look at the distribution of activity, it's almost equal in all those areas. And if there could be more than 100%, with mathematicians in the room, your heads are going to explode, it would be bigger than that. They are doing all of these things to the greatest degree as compared to other institutional types. They are doing incredible research, as you've heard, whether they're R1 or R2, what are funded by whomever. Amazing, incredible research, basic and applied, that you hear. The teaching is stellar, as Cecilia mentioned, in terms of comparison. Incredible. They're teaching a large number of students, and the faculty are carrying often pretty heavy teaching loads. And that service component is in direct service to the communities around them. It's not just like sort of the buffer of what faculty members put on there for their tenure and promotion file of like, oh yeah, I chaired this and I was the editor of this journal and I was on this committee on campus. This is like, no, I was deeply embedded in this community and doing service to this city, to this community. That is something that's hard to get your head around when we have otherwise in the higher education ecosystem relegated each of those things to different types of institutions. These institutions are doing all three to an incredible level, and they are dedicated while doing so to both access and excellence, which is a really hard thing to do, to meet both of those at the same time.
Well, thank you all. This was a lovely conversation. Please indulge me while we do a reset as we transition to the Q&A portion of the event. So for those just joining via our live stream or radio audience, I'm Amy Morona, the statewide higher education reporter at Signal, Ohio, and moderator for today's conversation. Today we are talking about the future of regional public universities like Cleveland State and the universities of Akron and Toledo. Joining me on stage are Dr. Jennifer Koip, Executive Director at the Coalition of Urban Serving Universities, Dr. Nigamath Streeter, Senior Vice President and Provost at Cleveland State University, and Dr. Cecilia M. Orphan, Associate Professor of Higher Education at the University of Denver and founding co-director at the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. Thank you all. Great. Pete, we will start with you here.
Great, thank you. Great conversation. My name is Pete Van Leer. I'm a researcher with Policy Matters Ohio and a co-founder of Honesty for Higher Education. Dr. Koop, your story about your father and grandfather made me think about this, and then you and Dr. Streeter, you also talked about the high percentage of Pell receiving students. So the House, the U.S. House, in its proposal seems to be wanting to limit eligibility to full-time students and increasing the number of hours you have to get Pell to study. And so I'm wondering, especially in a state like Ohio, where there's been essentially a double-digit cut to state support for public higher ed, if you take inflation into account over the past 2 decades, and also a poorly structured grant program for the state financial aid program that's also connected to Pell. How do you see that impacting not only schools in Ohio, but how are in other states that if they do, and the Senate has a different proposal, but if they do change that to the House proposal, how do you see that impacting the kind of universities you're talking about?
They both looked at me. You're making comments on big, beautiful bills and reconciliation. I'm not sure I'm equipped for that. But no, it's what I said. I'm very concerned about what that means. Pell is a complex thing, though, because on the other side, to be fair, there's a great deal of interest in investing in short-term Pell, which allows for that sort of quicker certification kind of thing. So it's a complicated thing that I'm certainly not a financial aid expert by any means. But I will say that I do, as I said, have grave concern about what that is going to do, and it does seem to be that the cutoff is increasing so that fewer and fewer people have access to it, and so there are students that I think are going to be gravely affected by this and maybe have to look at different options. And I think in some ways that's where I see often, we didn't talk about this, but the relationships that these institutions also have with community colleges in the area might become even more critical to create pipelines to offset that. And so that's another conversation, but these institutions typically do have very strong articulation agreements and connections to community colleges. That's another part of the ecosystem of urban areas, typically, is this community college to 4-year pipeline with these institutions. So it's a poor, oversimplified answer to your question, but yeah, I'm right there with you in terms of the concern. I don't know that I have an answer.
And the institutions, it's important to consider the impact on them. I want to also expand on the human impact. So when I graduated from college, it was in 2006, I attended Portland State University. I qualified for maximum Pell Grants, and my Pell Grant plus I think it was like $500 or $1,000 of state grant aid covered the entire cost of my tuition and fees, my books, and some of my living expenses. And when I tell my students now who study higher education that that was the way it was for me 20 years ago, they cannot believe it. Because not only have we made, or are we considering making it harder to get Pell, which by the way was created with this promise or compact in mind that if you aspire to better yourself and your family and go to college, the federal government will help you make that happen. That was a promise we made to Americans in this country. And that promise has slowly been chipped away at. And I will tell you right now, I have a 7-week-old son and a 2.5-year-old daughter, and their lives are profoundly different than my life was as a child because of Pell. That is the impact of Pell. That is the human transformation that Pell has created for generations, and we are stripping that away, and it is deeply troubling.
A quick reporter's note as also just someone who had a Pell grant. Pell also opens you up to so many other scholarship opportunities, last dollar programs, et cetera. So just an added piece of context to keep in mind there.
Hi, Kirsten Ellenbogen, Great Lakes Science Center. There's a lot of buzz about microcredentials. Is this harmful, helpful to urban regional universities? How are these affecting you?
I'll take a crack at it, and then I'll let my colleagues jump in as well. So there is a lot of buzz, and our approach to it is, again, if we are serving this region, if we are Cleveland's university, then we have to provide opportunities of different kinds to the different kinds of students that come to our door, right? So if there are students that come and say they want a micro-credential, we're going to figure out a way to provide those micro-credentials. If there are companies that come along and say we want to create a talent pipeline that with a micro-credential, then that's what we'll do, right? What we are doing, on the other hand, alongside that is making close alignments with our regular, what I'll call regular degree programs, degree-seeking students, and saying, how can we create transition pipelines? So a student may come to us and say, I'm not interested in a 4-year degree, but I want to learn how I can do podcasting, right? How can that podcasting 4-week certificate or a micro-credential translate into interest for the student and an opening of eyes and doors so that they may eventually end up with a 4-year bachelor's degree in communication, right? So that's the that's that ladder that we need to make clear, and I think it becomes even more critical for an institution that is a regional public than for an R1 or for a private institution, because those institutions typically have long wait lists, right? Institutions like mine are essentially saying, like, how can we get more people that we can serve and support, as opposed to how can we keep people out of here?
Yeah, ditto in many ways. Just two quick things. One, I think that the hallmark of American higher education is its diversity, and it's the different ways people can connect to it. And to the degree that those micro-credentials are immediate, get people educated, get people in. And I was also going to mention that they're typically historically called stackable degrees, right? You get somebody in to do that, and that interest them, and then maybe they want to do journalism or, The challenge with stackable degrees, though, is that we tend to make them very isolated, right? And it's up to the student then to string them together. And prior to where I am now, I used to be at the National Resource Center for the first-year experience in students in transition, and your worst leakage points in any persistence of any kind of program is that transition, where it's up to the student to sort of say, like, okay, now this degree needs to stack on that one, what do I do? So as we think about stackable degrees, and what you're speaking about, we have to think about how they really do link up, right, in ways that are very organic and easy for students to go, yeah, I love that. You know what, I think I do want to pursue a degree in journalism. And then it's not just sort of going, okay, that's a great idea, have fun with that. So I think there can be real opportunity.
Quick follow-up, and I know I'm not supposed to, but I can't help but not. One, I don't know about the journalism degree, but just kidding, my boss is in the room. But two, I think is a very important point, especially right now in the workforce Pell expansion conversation, to say, not all micro-credentials or credentials broadly are created equal, right? So can we give just a very quick kind of overview of what that process looks like, not even in terms of accreditation or like boring stuff, but just, like ROI or, how people weigh one credential versus another in terms of value and who's doing that right now nationally. And I know, again, that could like legit be a whole other forum.
Yeah, that could be a whole other forum. And actually, I'm going to give a very brief answer to that. And then, again, because that's a long topic that we can keep going on. In Ohio, the way that we talk about these micro-credentials is based on what the state calls in-demand occupations that Jobs Ohio has defined. And there is a list. There is a specific list of various job codes and associated zip codes that education programs get associated with. That you say, if you do this kind of certificate or credential, if you earn this kind of thing, here's where you could get placed in a job. So that's the level at which the state defines it, and that's where we'll leave it at this point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer, for sharing with us the story of your grandfather. I was just wondering if any of the other panelists had any stories to share about how the regional universities have aided immigrants and or refugees.
I mean, I'll just share that I'm myself a first-generation immigrant. I came to this country to go to graduate school. I grew up in India, earned a college degree in India. I did not attend a regional public. Like I said, I went to Ohio State University to earn a graduate degree, but that's what brought me to this country. I will say, 14% of our students at Cleveland State are international students. Students that come to the United States, come to Cleveland to earn a degree. And across the university, 80% of our graduates are within the state of Ohio, 10 years after graduation, working and contributing to this economy and to this community. So when you talk about immigration and immigrants, Cleveland is losing population to the rest of the state, and Ohio is losing population to the rest of the country. We have to have ways of attracting people to come to our community, to come to our city and grow the population and grow the impact.
Not just. I'll add another example. In my home state of Colorado, the University of Northern Colorado is located in Greeley, Colorado. It's a very rural part of the state. And it's also the site of a refugee resettlement area. And so that university does a lot of work to partner with, support, and also educate the children and the refugees that are being resettled there. So that is another example of how that regional service mission plays out in a very specific and unique way to that community. So we also find there are a number of refugees, in addition to international students that go through different types of visa processes that these institutions serve. It's a great question.
And if you want, that's not a story, but more resources, another of our partner organizations in the alphabet soup of DC, the National Association of System Heads, or NASH, has a major refugee project that they're doing with their system heads. And many of these regional comprehensive institutions are part of systems. And so that might be worthy of taking a look.
Hi, thank you very much. I am a very grateful product of the University of Akron master's program, creative nonfiction. Yes, and I enjoyed every second of being on that campus. And I have quite a debt of gratitude to the University of Akron. I loved the idea of the threefold mission. And this question is a little bit about mission creep. The thing that distinguishes also these schools is that they're urban and commuter based, but then with this component also of the international student, the mission creep involving, say, real estate with with these schools, and the internal pressures of having to save money, budget concerns, have led to a lot of, say, online learning and perhaps investment in property that has been difficult with the diminishing population of schools. Can you say anything to the sort of internal pressures that these colleges have to make that they might either be able to avoid with, or anything that about the internal pressures? You've talked a lot about the external pressures, but what about the internal pressures?
Who wants to spill the tea? Wow, that's
I'll take a crack at it, right? So again, we're a campus of 14,000 students. About 1,800 students live on campus housing, right? So that's 13-14%. We are largely a commuter campus, right? More than 80% of our students commute to our campus, commute to classes. Many, if not most, if not all of our international students actually live off campus. Very few of our international students actually live in CSU housing. So again, from an internal pressures perspective, the pressure, I'll say, and I have my colleague Randy Dykey, who manages enrollment management at Cleveland State here. He will say the big challenge is finding that right mix of students who want a residential experience at an urban institution versus the student that just wants to come in for 3 hours a day, attend classes, and leave. Again, to the point that I think we've all been making for the last 40 minutes, we want the student, right? All of those students. We want to be able to support the student who comes in as a commuter, and we want to be able to support and provide the residential experience for the student who wants the residential experience. Again, you used the word mission creep in your question. I don't see it as mission creep when we provide residential opportunities as well as commuter opportunities. I see it as supporting all the students that come to our door, right? So it's, early on, Cecilia, you talked about, not being selective. And the term that we talk about at CSU is inclusive excellence, saying, anybody that wants a CSU education, we will provide one, and we will provide the best possible education to that student in the way, and provide the wraparound supports that student needs. And so I would put that in that bucket of how do we support our student body.
I'm going to talk about parking again, because I guess I'm the parking attendant of this forum, but parking is a really important symbol for all of this. And there was a time when states like Ohio, like Colorado, invested heavily into regional public, so much so that 50–60% of their funding came from the state. What proportion of your budget comes from the state right now?
Between 27 and 29, depending on how you count.
Okay, so that's a huge loss. This is something that hasn't been studied, but it's something I've observed through my research, not in a systematic way. When states started cutting funding, one thing institutions started doing was charging for parking. Seems like a small issue. It is not a small issue. Another thing that they started to do is tear down parking garages and build dormitories, because dormitories is a source of revenue. Is it mission creep? Possibly, because in some ways, that's signaling to students who belongs here, who we are trying to prioritize. The other side of that coin is institutions are really desperate to try and figure out how do we keep the doors open and serve our students, knowing that the state, just like we are eroding the promise of Pell, states have eroded their promise to support these institutions. And so they're really struggling with trying to figure out how do we serve all students and generate the revenue that we need to keep the lights on.
So glad to have the last questions.
No pressure.
Oh. This is really pressuring. But anyway, hi, my name is Nog, pronouns she, her, hers. I'm a summer fellows with the Cleveland Foundations, but also a grad student with NYU Wagner School of Public Services. My questions has to do with the recent crackdown on DEI. I wonder if you can respond to the recent crackdown on DEI, where university are changing a lot of its initiative to more broader term like belonging, but also donor refusing to give more funding to a university because they don't want to be associated with the term. My question has to do with what is your strategy in responding to the current state and federal restriction for DEI, and what is some of the plan that your university doing to ensure that you're still supporting marginalized students while also making sure that all the progress that we have done in relation to DEI is not being reversed because of the current administrations?
So go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I was like, you can touch that third rail. That's all you.
I'll take the third rail. Because again, if we say we are Cleveland's university, and this is a city that is a large, diverse metropolis that has a variety of different kinds of people that live here, it is our job to serve all of our students. I think that when we talk about the state and federal policies, at the root of it is our policies and programs at universities that might be seen as exclusionary programs, right? The programs that we offer in our university, in our Division of Student Belonging and Success, are intended to be inclusive, not exclusive. They're not intended to keep students away from each other. They're intended to create spaces where different kinds of students can come and discover each other and learn about each other. So again, from our perspective, it is we're here to serve all of our students. We're not talking about how we can create exclusionary groups, and that's our response.
Thank you so much to Dr. Koip, Dr. Orphan, Dr. Sridhar, and Amy Morona for joining us at the City Club today. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. Today's forum is also part of the City Club's Education Innovation Series in partnership with Nordson and the Martha Holden Jennings Foundation. Thank you so much to those two organizations for their support. The City Club would like to welcome students joining us from the ACE Mentor Program of Cleveland, and we would also like to welcome guests at the tables hosted by the Cleveland Foundation Summer Internship Program, the Cleveland State University Provost, College Now, Friends of Higher Education, and Greater Cleveland Partnership. Thank you for joining us. We are off next Friday, July 4th, in honor of Independence Day, but be sure to join us the following week, starting on Tuesday, July 8th. We will welcome American Bar Association President William Bay to discuss the rule of law. And on Friday, July 11th, we welcome Tim Hafey, the lead investigator into both January 6th and Charlottesville. He will discuss his book, Harbingers, and how we can protect democracy in the years ahead. You can learn more about these two forums and so many more at cityclub.org. That brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you once again to our speakers and to our members and friends of the City Club. I'm Cynthia Connolly, and this forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
The ideas expressed in City Club forums are those of the speakers and not of the City Club of Cleveland, IdeaStream Public Media, or their sponsors. Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.